We were in a taxi one day going down to the Ministry of Interior to develop the relationship, and the people we were seeing were in the monitoring. We wanted to see people in their monitoring and evaluation unit of their human resources operation. We didn't see them in the end. And I said to the taxi driver, "Ministry of Interior, please." And he said, "Oh, that's where I work." I said, "Oh, that's good. Whereabouts do you work?" He said, "No, here's my card." So he showed me his plastic card, which allowed him to get in and out of the gates. And he said, "I work in the monitoring and evaluation unit." I said, "Oh, well, I'm not going to say that's where we're going." And I said, "Well, how do you manage to get a time off to drive a taxi?" He said, well, you know, we do. Maybe, you know, we take some days off and we pass some money back and we drive a taxi. The structure of the state is there for other business as well as the structure of the state. That gives any intervener, an aid intervener, a diplomatic intervener, a military intervener, lots of overheads to deal with as well, because things take time. You have to wait for the guy with the taxi to come to work to get your work done. The weakness of the state, therefore, makes the idea of Yemen as a country a little unstable in our terms. Will the state decay to the degree that leaders of tribes run the country? Well, they do in a way now. What's the difference? Well, it's very complicated to deal with 60 men rather than the office of the president or the office of the foreign minister. So diplomacy becomes more expensive. And we saw that in Indonesia after the disappearance of Suharto, when centralisation in Indonesia became diffused. And now we have a number of consulates, and our diplomatic effort in Indonesia is more expensive to get bilateral matters done than it was in the past. Now, with Yemen, the state doesn't deliver many services. It's not visible to most of the population. The country itself maybe is 70% of the territory is out of the government's direct control. They might make spot interventions here and there, but many parts of the country, the military, like in this photograph, or the police, are not allowed to go because they haven't got permission from the tribal leaders in that region to go into it. The two roads to the oil area of Marib, one of those is cut permanently to the government. No government comes on that road. The main road between Sana'a and Aden was cut after I arrived for 3 weeks through tribal fighting with the army. Imagine you not being able to drive, for example, to Albury from here because those people in Yas are shooting it out with the ADF. And that's how it is. Stability of Yemen. The stability of Yemen really is woven through the traditional interactions of the tribes, their common understanding of what's right for them and what's not, the common currency of negotiation, monetarization of favours, exchange. There's an intimate logic involved in it, and it's a logic which is legible to people who take the time, but unfortunately it's not the logic that governments work with. They work with a man or a woman sitting in an office with a telephone and a job, and only if they can have the time do they get to see the other side of the country. And unfortunately, Yemen, because of its circumstances, you can't get out of the city of Sana'a very easily. You need government approval to do so, and sometimes that comes and sometimes that doesn't. The other thing that I need to mention is, in addition to the economic weakness of the place, the decline in oil revenues. You know, we've got 75% less money this year in Yemen from oil than the year before. The Yemenis recently tried to ask the Koreans to pay more for their gas contract than struck. Koreans said no. The Yemen government has asked for more aid money. Now there's conditions being attached to its use, and let's see more percent of our aid money actually be applied to aid projects. Those things are occurring. The Friends of Yemen group of around, I think, 11 or so countries has started to tighten the screws a little bit on the Yemen government in terms of what it does with aid when it receives it. The Kuwaitis and Saudis provide cash to the country, and those two countries are on the record as saying sometimes they don't know what it does. But it does get recycled, at least in part, and perhaps that's why we haven't seen more difficulties in the country yet. But people are edgy there. In the lead up to 1994, tribesmen came into Sana'a and marked shops. This is not a Kabili, this is not a tribal shop. This is, you're okay. This is not. Your shop got an X, and if the tribesmen came to sack the town, you're finished. Not necessarily personally, but your shop's gone. It'll be under somebody else's control. And the Senani people and the government know that a major difficulty is always possible in the country. The capital, however, has around 60,000 soldiers in several bases on its perimeter, and they can field a lot of force within a couple of hours if necessary, but that's not everywhere in the country, and that's only the last stand, and Sana'a is only Sana'a because the government is there. The rest of the country wouldn't necessarily be gravely affected by a coup or a revolt. Yemen's population is growing very, very rapidly. Its pace of economic growth, even though, implausibly, I think forecast, well, if it is plausible, 7.8% growth in GDP for Yemen this year is still not enough to keep up with its population growth. There's vast unemployment. The median age of the entire country is 17. 45% of people are under the age of 18 or so, so that gives a median age of 17, the halfway point in the bell curve. When you come back to Australia, you're struck by the number of old people. Now, it's true, you just don't see old people in Yemen. You see thousands of youngish people, and most of whom don't have work. According to the US Bureau of Census, there'll be 34 million Yemenis by 2020, and then there'll be 78 million by 2050. But where the water comes from, where the food will come from, where the money and the work will come from, where those people might be if they do arrive, is an open question. Sana'a hasn't got enough water to drink. It will run dry. In the second largest city in the country, people already suffer no water deliveries through town pipes except for 1 or 2 days a month. And you store your water in an underground tank and you eke that out, or you buy a little truck to come and deliver your water for you. Most families will have girls that walk 2, 3, 4 hours a day to carry water, and they're girls who are therefore not at school. And that's social change which is inhibited because the diversity of discussion in the household is reduced. The GDP per capita of Yemen, according to the World Bank, is around 2,500. That was during an oil boom year before last. Australia's GDP per capita is 32,000. There's quite a big difference, and the distributional effects of government spending in Australia are much more equitable and fair than they are in Yemen. There's virtually nothing out there. If you can't do it yourself, you don't get it. The exploitation of natural resources in Yemen is very, very complicated. We have a Sydney-based firm, Oil Search. I suppose if anyone has superannuation, their superannuation fund will have shares in Oil Search. A very, very professional business indeed, and well established with the system, and particularly in its dealings with the tribes in Yemen. But the overheads for companies like Oil Search and others to find and extract resources for the government and the people of Yemen to also benefit from are very high. Those overheads, to get a decision through a parliamentary committee, can take a year, 2 years, and they're very small decisions indeed relating to oil field operations. There's mineral wealth in Yemen, but it's a long way away from being developed. Land access is a little bit like it might be in parts of the South Pacific. Highly negotiable, unsettled. always subject to a second, third or fourth opinion. Papers will get rewritten. The growth of the country is held back by opportunistic margin taking by people who can profit or benefit from development. And that's not unnatural, but it's just to the degree that it occurs makes it very difficult to live with. Western oil companies have gone, however, to the Ministry of Oil and said, we're not buying a third or fourth security force, we're not paying the army to protect ourselves to a degree more than necessary. We can't continue to make payments for which Transparency International might raise an eyebrow. We can't do these things. It's your job to provide an enabling environment for development. But that's not an enabling environment to accrue personal wealth. So it's a waiting game between Western investors and the government, and the Yemenis understand that in the absence of an American oil firm, there'll be an Indian one, or an Indonesian one, or a Chinese one, any of which will be easier to deal with under terms that the locals well understand. On the food front, 80% of its cereals are imported. Big bread eaters, Yemenis. They love rice. 100% of their rice is imported. They can't afford Australian lamb. It's too expensive, let alone this season's lamb, which is very expensive in Australia. They can't afford Australian lamb. They don't like Australian mutton because it smells, which is not an unnatural reaction. It's the same problem in Europe. So they eat Somali lamb and Ethiopian lamb, meagre and small as it is. Australia is renowned in the country for its wheat and flour exports from former times. It makes lovely bread, but it's a memory because our prices for the quality of protein and dryness of our wheat make it far too expensive for Yemenis to buy. So now we've declined in almost logarithmic jumps downwards to 7th position in wheat exports, as the Russians have moved up towards the top, Ukrainians and so on. And the Russians link some of their wheat trade with arms deals, and all of those are subject to soft credit as well. That's part of the diplomatic jostling going on in the area. I've mentioned seafood. 50% of their take from the ocean is spoiled by the time it gets to its major market, Saudi Arabia, because the transport trucks don't refrigerate effectively, the ice melts, and the fish has probably gone off in the small boat where it's caught by a hand net in the main, in any case. But it does employ a lot of people at a low level, and it's an area which national security is also dependent on. The level of technology in agriculture is very low. I've mentioned before Australia could make useful interventions there. This photograph before you now is probably, it's an agricultural picture actually, not immediately recognisable as such. It's an agricultural market, and it's an agricultural market that sells gat, the shrub, the leaf of which is a stimulant, unlike coffee, which makes you tremble. Gat just makes you feel great. So there's some men come in from the hills outside the town of Ib to the gat market to buy gat. One of them's holding it there in a red plastic bag. See that? And because they're out-of-towners, they look after themselves, and they have to look after their family's honour and their own name, and therefore they're weaponised in order to do so. I've mentioned the tribal method of getting things done. Here's a village elder from representative of 3 small towns at a tribal sheikh's house. I went there to have a general chat, and these men were also there. They'd come in to be told what their obligations were to get electricity. The sheikh has delivered 3 villages worth of electricity, so they don't have to run a diesel. They can get cheaper power from the state grid when it works or is not being blown up or sabotaged by other tribesmen. That's the deal that's been held up in front of us, and it's been signed in thumb ink. You can see there in the blue patches. And the deal is not to steal electricity, to go to the market to buy a meter, to use the meter. They're the 3 things that the sheikh obliged his tribesmen and villagers to do in order to get the electricity on. This man stood up at the end of the meeting waved his finger at the tribal elder and said, "But no electrician will enter any house in any of our villages." And that's because of looking after your family's honour, your family's name, and the privacy of your house. The tribal chief said, "Of course, you've already got wires going into it from the generator. No one needs to go inside. This is all going to be done outside." But it shows the conservatism of the country and its sensitivity to values which we don't hold in the same way. Yemen and Somalia do share similar values in that regard. The tourism sector of Yemen has suffered terribly badly because of Al-Qaeda. This is the scene from where 4 Koreans were blown apart last year by a young man from another village who walked up to them and did so. Several Yemenis were also killed at this vantage point. That's a World Heritage listed mud brick town of Shibam Hadramaut, and it's a dead city. It's a dead city because many of the people in this area have migrated outside for work, if not overseas. But it's a dead city because there's not one tourist there. The day I went, no one else who was not local had been there for 2 weeks, and that was a single Brit. There's not a place to buy a cup of tea aside from a man with a gas burner and a kettle on the top for a World Heritage investment. And that's the damage that Yemenis feel terrorism and instability has caused their life chances. To get around the country, you do need sometimes a police escort, and generally the policemen are quite kind and happy to have a chat with you from time to time. And on occasion, one could go through a police checkpoint and not be noticed and not have an escort. But in this case, they caught us and led us ahead with their siren, as sometimes happens, isn't it? The siren and loudspeaker blaring, drawing even more attention to a kidnappable foreigner. Shopping is always fun, as we know. It's not Castlereagh Street, but this is the old city. And I suppose this is the most foolish thing I ever did in Yemen, was take a picture of 2 close personal protection people and their Western protectees. They must have been some high-value targets, because the 2 men where I pointed the arrows to are their gunslingers taking them shopping for trinkets in the Sana'a market. Now for tourists, when you go to the World Heritage listed old city of Sana'a, there's 4 places in Yemen which are World Heritage listed, and they should all be generating good money, but they're not. If you stay in a little older hotel inside the city, the local tourism department gives you an escort to walk around with in the market, because they're anxious about what might happen to you. And in any good hotel, just like Sofitel across the road, you check your guns on arrival, or you leave them behind the counter while you go to the restaurant. And that's a symptom of the way of life there. Out in the tribal areas, everybody has guns, and even the casual visitor, when they go, gets a photograph taken with one as well. These young men there standing in the top right are off-duty policemen on the big Eid, the big religious festival at the end of after Ramadan, and you can see there knife and gun. That's how Yemen is. People look after themselves. With Yemen, I'm going to conclude with one remark on governance. People in Yemen want justice. They want a rule of law. They want some transparency about how that happens. The government can't deliver it, and so therefore we see photographs like this, which are, in one sense, they should be relics of a former time in terms of state growth, but they're dominant images of the culture there today. The other issue I should say is the power of the parliament is negligible. There's 301 members in the lower house and 111 in the upper house, and they have very, very little to say. They do call in ministers to give them a browbeating. The Minister of Interior was browbeaten by Parliament over terrorism. The Minister of Defence was browbeaten over the problem of the war with the Houthis in the north, but nothing really changes on that. and the Parliament is not a public voice for change really in the country. It's another tool. It's another tool of how a country like Yemen is run by the clans and tribes. And one of the main things that I did want to just leave with you is that for very cheap interventions, situations like this, where a friend of mine picked up off the street and sold back to us from prison. That's a little business you can run if you're a municipal employee. Is you take people off the street, ask them for their papers, which they're probably not carrying. They're locked up until a relative turns up to buy them out. And this is the circumstance right in the middle of town with a municipal prison. This is not police prison. There are private prisons under people's houses as well. One thing you have to give it to the Yemenis is they're very enterprising, and they can find a margin in all sorts of activities which wouldn't normally be expected in Australia. So cash collection is a big issue, but poverty drives that, and with any luck, if they can control their internal circumstances, devolve some of the political power in a way which gives people voice, accept development for what it is, and grow, we won't have incentives which are driving a behaviour like this photograph illustrates, and the waste which is occurring in the country. So that's a sort of a tour d'horizon of the environment there for you, and I hope parts of that have been interesting. There is some press in Yemen. It's very active. Everybody's got something to say, up to a point. You can't believe what gets said compared with the quite frightful censorship in the liberated Arab Gulf. You can't say anything in those countries compared with Yemen. Yemen's very vocal, and you can have demonstrations like this one here about the government arrest of a southern newspaper editor. Journalists will have meetings and discuss things. This photograph here, the man on the right was kidnapped on Sunday by the political security organisation because he'd been writing about Al-Qaeda and they wanted to know more than he'd written. So they, rather than inviting him in for a cup of tea and a talk, they kidnapped him from the street. So he was released the day before yesterday. And this, I'll conclude the photographs with this picture. This is how business gets done. And the message in it is important. There's 65 senior tribesmen and tribal elders from the northern and eastern part of the country in this room. They met to discuss their horror at the kidnapping of 9 Germans, 3 of which I think were executed virtually immediately. And the others, I think the children have been passed back, haven't they? Yeah, to Germany after they've lost their speech. They speak Arabic, not German any longer. In a meeting like this, there will be a structure. People will make a statement from the floor. Everybody who spoke said they respected the Germans. They'd done very good things for the country for 40 years or so. It was a shame. Social change was damaging the tribe's image. Kidnappings were out of hand. The youth had become uncontrollable. I sat there, and many of the men left, and afterwards I asked a cousin of the host, well, what would have been said if the kidnappees were Americans? And the answer was probably nothing like you heard, which shows a division of view between what is America, what is Yemen, and who are acceptable other foreigners. And as Australians, we have to bear in mind sometimes our allegiances and our associations carry very heavy impact in the perceptions of others. And to have empathy denied for the hypothetical kidnapping of Americans is a message for us of the way we sit sometimes in these international environments. So thank you very much.